The Quran says God is pleased with them. But here is the unsettling question. Can God be pleased with someone and later no longer be pleased with them? And if the answer is yes, then what exactly does the Quran, Surah Tawbah, Surah number 9, verse 100 mean? Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to Reflection, where we explore the deeper meanings, insights, and realities revealed in the Quran. There are few descriptions of a human being more extraordinary than this. God is pleased with them. Not simply that God has forgiven them, not simply that He will reward them, but that He is pleased with them. And then the Quran goes further. It says, they are pleased with Him. But who exactly are these people? Is the Quran praising an entire generation simply because they lived beside the Prophet? Is divine pleasure attached permanently to a historical identity? Or is the verse revealing something much deeper about faith, truth, virtue, and accountability? In this episode, we will explore who are the early vanguard. Why does one small word min matter so much? What does it mean to follow someone in virtue? And ultimately, can divine pleasure ever be lost? Allah tells us in Surah Tawbah, that is Surah number 9, verse 100, وَالسَّابِقُونَ الْأَوَّلُونَ مِنَ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُم بِإِحْسَانٍ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ وَأَعَدَّ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي تَحْتَهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. The early vanguard of the emigrants and the helpers, and those who follow them in virtue, God is pleased with them, and they are pleased with Him, and He has prepared for them gardens with streams running in them, to remain in them forever. That is the great success. The verse begins with al-sābiqūn, al-awwalūn, the early vanguard, those who came first. But first, in what sense? Different explanations have been offered, some connected with the phrase with those who prayed towards both Jerusalem and Mecca, others with those who participated in the Battle of Badr, others with the pledge of Hudaybiyah, and others with those who embraced Islam before the migration to Medina. But Allamah Tabataba'i makes an important observation. The verse itself does not restrict the expression to one particular event. Its meaning is broader. These are those who preceded others in faith. And to understand why that matters, we have to remember what faith looked like at the beginning of Islam. There was no political power to join, no worldly success to benefit from, no prestige attached to becoming a Muslim. There was persecution, pressure, and loss. Some believers migrated to Abyssinia. Others left their homes in Mecca and traveled to Medina. And in Medina, the Ansar opened their homes, shared what they possessed, protected the Prophet, and supported a community whose worldly future was still uncertain. So their precedence was not merely chronological. They stood with truth before its victory was visible. They chose faith when choosing faith could cost them something. But then Allamah Tabataba'i draws our attention to one small word, min al-muhajirin wal-ansar, of the emigrants and the helpers. The word is min, from, among. Allamah Tabataba'i understands it here as partitive. In other words, the verse speaks about the early vanguard from among the muhajirun and the ansar. That is not necessarily the same as saying every muhajir, every ansari, every person who belonged to those historical groups. And this matters because the Quran itself does not describe the early Muslim community as morally uniform. They were people of extraordinary faith. But the Quran also speaks about hypocrisy, disobedience, transgression, and sickness within hearts. So simply living in the age of revelation did not remove moral accountability. Being close to the Prophet was an extraordinary privilege. But proximity is not the same as righteousness. The Quran praises people for real qualities, their faith, their sacrifice, their sincerity, their perseverance. The honor is real, but accountability remains real too. Think about this. They were not distinguished merely because they came first. They were distinguished because they chose truth when choosing a demanded sacrifice. The verse then introduces another group, وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُمْ بِإِحْسَانٍ, and those who follow them in virtue. This may be one of the most important phrases in the verse. What exactly does it mean to follow someone in virtue? At first, we might think the verse simply means that the early believers were virtuous, and later believers copied their virtue. But Allamah makes a subtle distinction. The word ihsan describes the manner of following. Their following itself was virtuous. And why? Because he explains they followed them because the truth was with them. That changes everything. The Qur'an is not telling later generations, follow these people simply because they came before you. Rather, they were worthy of being followed because they stood with truth. And if you follow someone because truth is with them, then ultimately you are following the truth itself. This is a profound principle because human beings often reverses the order. We begin with a personality, a scholar, a leader, a historical figure, a community. And once we become attached to that person or group, we can begin deciding that whatever they say or do must therefore be right. But the Quranic logic is the opposite. Truth comes first. The person is worthy of following because he or she is aligned with it. The person does not define truth. Truth determines the value of the person. And there is another beautiful dimension here. You and I can never be among the first muhajirun. We cannot become the original Ansar. Those historical opportunities have passed. But the Quran adds, those who follow them in virtue. And Allamah does not restrict this category to one particular generation. The historical opportunity has closed, but the moral opportunity remains open. A believer 14 centuries later can still recognize truth, stand with it, sacrifice for it, and follow those who carry it with ihsan. The faces change, the circumstances change, but the moral test remains. Reflect on this. Do we follow people because truth is with them? Or do we decide what is true because of the people we have already chosen to follow? Now we reach the words at the heart of the verse. رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. God is pleased with them and they are pleased with him. What does that actually mean? Allamah Tabataba'i begins with the meaning of rida, pleasure, contentment, satisfaction. For the human being pleased with God means that the heart is no longer fundamentally resisting him. The servant accepts his guidance, his moral ordinances, his wisdom, his governance, but this does not mean that life becomes painless. It does not mean that a believer never grieves, and it does not mean that tragedy suddenly becomes pleasant. Rida is deeper than emotion. A person may suffer and still trust God. A person may grieve and still trust God. A person may not understand why something has happened and yet remain convinced that God has not acted without wisdom. And then we reach the other side. God is pleased with them. Does that mean that God experiences an emotional change? That he moves from one psychological state to another? Allamah Tabataba'i says no. Divine pleasure is an attribute of action. It describes how God relates to the servant, his mercy, his favor, his acceptance, his reward. God's essence does not change. We change. We obey or disobey. We draw near or move away. We repent or persist. We align ourselves with truth or turn away from it. And this also helps us understand the second half of the phrase. And they are pleased with him. Perhaps there comes a stage in the relationship with God where obedience becomes something deeper. At first, obedience may feel like discipline. God commands, and we struggle with ourselves to obey. But as faith deepens, obedience becomes trust. Trust becomes surrender, and surrender becomes contentment. The heart begins to move from, I will obey even though I wish things were different, towards, I trust your wisdom even when I cannot see it. We may never understand every event in our lives, but perhaps we can know God deeply enough to trust what we do not understand. Consider this. Maybe spiritual maturity is not reached when God gives us everything we want. Maybe it begins when knowing God changes what we want. And now we return to the question from the opening. Can God be pleased with someone and later no longer be pleased with them? If divine pleasure relates to the condition of the servant, then the condition of the servant matters. And human beings change. Someone can stand with truth today and abandon it tomorrow. Someone can begin well and end badly. But the opposite is also possible. A sinner can repent. A distant heart can return. A life can change direction. So divine approval at one moment cannot logically mean that every future action automatically becomes approved. But then something important happens in verse 100 in Surah number 9. The verse does not stop with radiyallahu anhum. God is pleased with them. It continues, وَعَدَّ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي تَحْتَهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا. And He has prepared for them gardens with streams running in them to remain in them forever. The pleasure described here is connected with their final destiny, with an enduring state, with a life that reaches its conclusion in faith and righteousness. This is not simply approval for one action at one moment in history. It points towards a completed moral journey. And this brings us to one of the more difficult discussions surrounding the verse. A tradition cited in Dur al-Manthur presents an interpretation in which the Qur'an is understood as guaranteeing paradise to all the companions of the Prophet, regardless of what they might later do. Allamah Tabataba'i challenges this interpretation, and his argument begins not with sectarian history, but with the Qur'an itself. If membership in a particular historical group created an unconditional guarantee of divine pleasure, what happens to accountability? What happens to the Qur'an's criticism of wrongdoing, transgression, hypocrisy, sin? It would effectively create two moral systems, one for a privileged historical group and another for everyone else. But the Qur'an does not present divine justice that way. The sacrifices of the earliest believers may be extraordinary. Their proximity to the Prophet may be unique. Their combination may be immense. None of that requires the abolition of accountability. In fact, their virtues have meaning precisely because their choices mattered. They could have turned away, but they remained. They could have chosen convenience, but they chose faith. The Qur'an can honor human beings magnificently without placing them above moral evaluation. And once again, we return to Allamah's central insight. They were followed because the truth was with them. Truth remains the measure. Think about this. Past virtue is not immunity. Past failure is not destiny. What matters is the direction in which we continue to move. The verse concludes, ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. That is the great success. What does the Quran call success here? Not wealth, not power, not recognition, not influence, not even being remembered by history. The great success is that a human being reaches the end of the journey and God is pleased with them. Think about how different that is from the way we normally measure a life. We ask what someone accumulated. The Quran asks what they became. We ask how high they rose. The Quran asks where they arrived before God. We measure reputation. The Quran measures reality because eventually wealth disappears, positions disappear, recognition disappears. Even the body through which experiences this world disappears. But divine pleasure belongs to another order entirely. And perhaps this is why paradise follows immediately. The garden is not merely a prize attached to an unrelated life. It is the final manifestation of a relationship that has reached fulfillment. A servant recognized truth, chose it, sacrificed for it, persisted in it, and returned to God through it. And then the Quran says, ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. That is the great success. Reflect on this. At the end of everything we pursue in this world, one question will remain. Did I become someone with whom God was pleased? Surah Tawbah, verse 100, begins with people who lived more than 14 centuries ago. But it does not leave us standing in history. It turns towards us. We cannot become the first Muhajirun. We cannot become the original Ansar, but we can still face the same moral questions. When truth becomes difficult, will we remain with it? When someone we admire stands with truth, will we follow them because truth is with them? And when someone we admire departs from truth, will our loyalty to God remain stronger than our loyalty to the person? Because the verse gives us a principle that reaches far beyond one generation. وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُمْ بِإِحْسَانٍ. And those who follow them in virtue, follow with ihsan, Follow with sincerity. Follow because truth is present, and through those who carry it, follow the truth itself. Then perhaps the question of divine pleasure becomes intensely personal. Not did I belong to the right group, not did I inherit the right label, but what did my faith actually make me become? And could I hope that one day these words might describe me? Radiyallahu anhum wa radu anh. God is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. Think about this. The question is not only who we follow. The deeper question is, what truth are we following through them? And when we step back from this verse, 4 lessons remain with us. First, the early vanguard were not distinguished simply because they came first. They chose faith and truth when doing so demanded sacrifice. Second, the word min reminds us that Quranic praise is precise. Historical identity does not remove moral accountability. Third, to follow the righteous in virtue means to follow them because truth is with them. Our ultimate loyalty, therefore, belongs to truth. Fourth, the greatest success is to live and return to God in a state where radiyallahu anhum wa radu anh. God is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. In our next episode, Why Leave Everything for Faith? We return to the Prophet's emigration from Mecca and the cave of Thawr. With danger closing in, he says, do not grieve. God is indeed with us. What does this reveal about sacrifice, trust, and divine support when every visible option seems to disappear? That is what we'll explore next. So join me next week for episode 50 of Reflection. And if you found this episode useful, please like, share, and subscribe and help others discover reflection. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.